am playing host. And thanks for joining me on Patterns, which is what we're calling the newsletter and now the lives, where we are tracing patterns in how power imposes itself on our lives so that we can try to make some sense of these really wild times where we often feel like we're getting punched in the face over and over again, but sometimes good things happen. Is that a fair
Yeah, I
summary,
think
Nathan?
I feel pretty punched in the face. So yeah,
Oh, no, but it's gonna be an uplifting conversation. We'll
okay,
have
I'm ready
some
for that too.
exciting things to talk about. But we are building on last week's post about the rise of the right in Latin America and where it fits into the Trump administration's declaration of war on the left, or what they're calling communism. Breaking, as of today, we also have the center, the third way of the Democratic Party, openly declaring war on said left. So we're getting it from all sides. If you haven't seen this, there was a New York Times story today about how Third Way is spending $15 million between now and the presidential elections to defeat democratic socialism. Okay. This is not a story that just started yesterday. And it's been a long time, as Veronica Gago and William Callison wrote in the Post last week, where Latin America has been treated as a laboratory, or in Greg Grandin's phrase, a workshop for U.S. fascism. In the 70s, it was Chile that played that role. Today, it's Argentina, El Salvador. We're going to be talking about other examples of it today with David. The politics of our hemisphere are moving really, really quickly. Over the past year, we have watched the far right consolidate power in country after country. We've also seen how the Trump administration has intervened, sometimes very explicitly and overtly and brazenly, in elections from Honduras to Colombia. We have seen right-wing tactics migrate from country to country. We are seeing the rise of actors like the Israeli state. Well, actually, that's not so new. Firms in Silicon Valley, venture capitalists like Peter Thiel doing all kinds of strange things. And this is ongoing. Brazil is headed into hugely consequential elections, presidential elections. There's the real prospect of a Bolsonaro family comeback, and we're going to be talking about this. So there's a lot going on, and I couldn't think of a better person to give us a kind of real overview, a real zoom out, as well as lots of specifics, than my first guest as at Substack, David Adler. So I'm just going to do a quick bio. David is the co-general coordinator of Progressive International, an organization that I've been on the board of at the beginning. It launched in 2020 with Bernie Sanders and Yanis Varoufakis. That's where David and I met, right, David? At
Yeah,
the Sanders Summit. Um, and the idea was to unite progressive movements. It was right after a brutal election in Brazil. I'm just remembering, like, it was right after Bolsonaro won those elections. And basically, the pitch for Progressive International was the right is coordinating across borders and the left better start doing it again more too, right? To counter this. Of course, left internationalism has a long history, very, very deep in the Americas. Okay. So David has really been on the ground in a lot of these countries during these elections. He also writes for The Guardian and Jacobin. Earlier this year, he organized the Nuestra America conference in Bogota, bringing together Latin American political forces in response to the U.S. intervention in Venezuela. And many of you may have heard his name when he participated in the first big international flotilla to Gaza since the genocide began. He was kidnapped and imprisoned by the Israeli government. Um, and that is just one of the ways that David has devoted his life to the ideas and practice of left internationalism. Welcome, David. How
thank
are
you.
you?
I'm
Where
okay.
are you? Where are
Yeah,
you?
I am right now. I'm in Mexico City. I'm actually in the Senate of the Republic in an unnamed senator's office. But you mentioned Nuestra America, which will be very relevant for our discussion. I'm sitting actually in a sea of portraits of the man who coined the term himself, Jose Marti, a Cuban American who pushed for an idea of our America that belonged to all of its peoples. Bad Bunny obviously vindicated that concept in bright colors at the Super Bowl. But I'm here actually for the first time since you were here as well, Naomi, for the second edition of the Pan American Congress, which is our effort to put together, as you say, democratic and progressive forces to put an alternative Nuestra America vision that is with enough strength, force, creativity, and audacity that we see the Trump administration vindicate its own version of the Monroe Doctrine that, as we'll get into in this discussion, has been extremely successful. We have to take our hat off to the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
We do?
That in No, I just mean that in 18 months they have managed to articulate for all of the flaws, stupidity, corruption, vapidity of this administration. There has been no greater success um, for them than in this pursuit of a realignment of the Latin American continent towards U.S. American interests in ways that are criminal, violent, and colonial, yes. But as we'll get to in our kind of panoramic view of the continent, principally driven by Marco Rubio's kind of obsession with the Monroe Doctrine and its renovation, this has been a pretty rapid escalation of hostilities that has led to a pretty equally rapid realignment of party political forces in the
Yeah.
region.
And I have to say it's we wanted to do this and have this focus in this you know pattern, what we're calling patterns, the newsletter, because in part because it really has not received the attention that it deserves, not just in big mainstream media in the United States, but even I would argue, in some of the alternative press, given how significant this realignment has been, right? I mean, I was there during the second Pan American Congress. The first one was in Colombia, which is significant in terms of the conversation we're going to have, because the government of Gustavo Petro has played such a leadership role in trying to cohere the left in the face of the genocide in Gaza and in the face of the U.S. attacks. Then the second one was in Mexico City, hosted by Claudia Sheinbaum's government. Now the third one is coming up in Uruguay. But in the intervening year, since we saw each other in Mexico City, so I mean, it was already starting, right? Like with the Milei government, and we were seeing these relationships, like the sort of fanboying of Bukele with his disgusting, torturous dungeons, and sending immigrants to the United States to CICOT, and sending influencers to make, videos about how cool it was, among other things. Um, and just the kind of cult that was being built around Milei in Argentina. In the year since that gathering, we've seen Colombia. I'm sorry, I'm going to make you a little
No, it's bad.
excited. Yeah. So we've seen Colombia flip to the hard right.
Yeah, Bolivia was first, then
Bolivia was
Honduras,
first.
then
Yep.
Colombia, then Chile, all in 1 year,
Yeah.
and with increased pressure being applied, squeezed at both ends of the continent in the form
Yeah.
of Mexico and Brazil, which are the two remaining real bastions of progressive left-wing
And
power.
a little tiny Uruguay in there, just holding. That's just why they're hosting the summit. Um, and Argentina, which had already, flipped to this weird crypto libertarian right, had an election also this year where they consolidated power in a kind of a midterm election, which we'll come to this extraordinary role the U.S. played in that. But David, I think it would help to just, because this has received so little coverage, some of these are familiar figures on the right, like in Chile. Um, uh, Jose Antonio Cast, he comes from this lineage where his brother I wrote about in the Shock Doctrine, because he was a really key quote unquote Chicago boy in Pinochet's dictatorship. He was head of the central bank, yeah, and he also was labor minister for a while. Really played a key role in designing Pinochet's economic shock program. his father was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. Um, so now we have the brother in power. I mean, he did have a card. Where
No,
he,
no, I know, and there's a Bavaria business which enriched the family tremendously on arrival to Chile that we don't know that much about. But you can
oh,
imagine how the Nazis, with their Bavaria business, may have been handling the
wow.
family wealth.
Okay, I'd like to know more about that. But okay, tell so that's who Cast is.
Yeah,
And I think that's important, okay? Brother Chicago boy, father Nazi. Some of the first things he's done is undercut efforts to understand the extent of the genocide in Chile under Pinochet. Um, but tell us more about who some of these other characters are, okay?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's helpful to understand at a very macro level that what we're seeing, it's very common for people to talk about pendular dynamics in Latin America. There's a pink tide and then a recession of that tide and the arrival of right-wing forces playing out principally since the arrival of democracy after the dictatorships that you were describing in places like Brazil, Argentina, in Chile. What we're seeing over the past really 15 years as we've seen the emergence of what we might call a reactionary international articulating itself in different nodes, Madrid, Buenos Aires, Miami, is a secular shift of the whole political spectrum to the far right.
Mhm.
And Latin America, is where we see many of its biggest monsters come into formation. So we're seeing the collapse of what we might call the traditional, more kind of neo-colonial, Latinfundista right, and the emergence of people like Javier Milei in Buenos Aires, who was basically a TV star, famous for his kind of ranting about Austrian school economics and why the state should recede from all forms of public life and we should let the market rip. And that it was actually the state that was to blame, not the IMF or other kinds of whatever, the pathology, the Argentine political economic system. It was the fact there was a welfare state at all that was to blame for all of these um, problems. And Milei, of course, finds his brother in Central America in the form of, as you mentioned, Bukele, who also emerges as a crypto libertarian character. And it's not a surprise that this is all kind of coordinated to the, again, secular shift to the right, as we see in the GOP towards a Trumpist camp, because these people are ingratiating themselves to that new sector, the crypto friendly kind of estafadista, like the schemer rights, grifter right, corruption right, mafioso right that's happening in the United States. So you have Cast in Chile. Jose Antonio Cast comes from a Nazi family who's sort of pushing the whole political spectrum towards the far right. In Brazil, of course, you have Jair Bolsonaro, who even after being put in prison for his coup attempt in the wake of Lula's inauguration back in 2023, remains a very living figure, principally through the form of his son, Flavio Bolsonaro, who's now leading the polls for the right, once again dragging the whole political spectrum over to a more radical vision. You know, so you've got Brazil, you've got the Bolsonaros. In Argentina, you have Milei. In Chile, you have Cast. And then moving up to the continent, you find equally cretinous figures. People in the chat are mentioning one country it just escaped my mind in the kind of flurry of defeats that we've had in recent months, which is that the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the very famous Peruvian violent authoritarian, famous for having sterilized thousands of indigenous women, cracked down on leftists in the name of kind of crushing shining path, all these kind of things. His daughter, Keiko Fujimori, has now come to power in Peru and has named as her foreign minister a guy who worked as director of communications for the U.S. Embassy for 15 years, and then moving across the South American continent in Bolivia, where the MAS governed for multiple terms. You had the collapse of the project and the rise of Paz, the current president, who's bringing sort of whiteness back again in its colonial form to governing Bolivia, also with the help of security assistance from the United States. You have Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, who is a banana billionaire, comes from the richest family in the country, who's again imbricating the United
Yeah.
States military apparatus. It's no coincidence you see Eric Prince, who founded Blackwater, crawling all over Quito. And then most recently, you have the case of Colombia with Abelardo de la Espriella, who was basically a lawyer for the most violent paramilitaries in the Colombian Civil War, come reality television star, TikTok celebrity. Again, beat out the sector of the traditional right to take power, Colombia, and that kind of stretches onward to a country like Honduras, where because of Roger Stone, and we could get into all the weird
You will
machination.
get into the weirdness of
Yeah.
Honduras and the tech billionaires and their dreams of having their own little state within a state there. But yeah,
I know. I think the point that I'm trying to make overall is there is no case in the rise of the new Latin American right that does not, in its origin, in its development and articulation, and in its arrival and implementation of its program, involve the United States. These are not autochthonous forms of radicalized right wing politics. They are, in one way or another, through the new tech platforms that are managed by algorithms developed by Elon Musk, through the military power of the Pentagon, or through the political interventions of the State Department, one way or another are incubated, deployed, and then managed through and with a relationship with the United States.
yeah. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I just want to say thank you for that. I mean, thank you for that very very setting overview. And by the way, we haven't even talked about Venezuela and
Right.
Cuba, the most overt like interventions in the form of bombs and sieges, right? Or kidnapping. So that is also happening. Um, and we've gotten some great questions, which I'm kind of going to kind of weave through, right? I let the sort of input shape the conversation I'm getting, but I also just want to flag, like, we have an hour. This is supposed to be an hour. We're trying to cover a huge amount of territory here. Um, and part of the reason I wanted to have a conversation now is that later this month, there is going to be the Pan American Congress in Uruguay, where progressive politicians from across the hemisphere are going to come together to strategize, right? To strategize about how to counter this. But also, having spent some time in Latin America, engage in self-criticism, your autocritica. Like, yes, it's U.S. intervention, but there are also internal reasons, which some of you have talked about, right? Writing from the countries themselves, that there also has to be lessons learned about how to to the extent that some of this can be stopped. Learn from missteps. In every country it's different, but we've heard some of this from readers in Peru, Bolivia, wanting us to make sure that we talk about that. So feel free to put your own thoughts in the chat, share those with others. Um, but yeah, so we won't get to everything. I'm just like, clearly, even just looking
I'll
at
do
where we are
my
right now.
best.
But we're going to start the conversation, and people are going to tune in to the conversations that happen during the summit, because there's fantastic political leaders that are gathering there, and those are going to be really important conversations. And I want you to make sure to tell us how we can follow it. Um, so there is this lineage, and there is also iteration. The left changes, the right changes, history changes. It doesn't repeat on a loop, right? So we are dealing, and I think you've explained this. Like, um, these are different types of far right figures. It's not the general in the suit, right? Who, with like the orderly troops behind him. It's more chaotic, right? Like, it is the era we're in. Everybody's monetizing. Everybody's trying to cash in. Everybody is trying to perform. It's very Trumpian in that way. Um, but let's talk more about the intervention, because that also looks different in different contexts, right?
Yeah.
Where to start? I mean, we could
We can walk through the arsenal. I think it's helpful to
yeah, the
understand
tools, yeah, the
because
arsenal of the
because
tools.
the 20th century idea of U.S. intervention really looks a lot like September 1973. Right? It looks like raining bombs and bullets on left-wing governments and leading coups in these places, and that was a playbook that played out in many parts of the Caribbean, North Central South America, and the Caribbean. From thinking about what happened in Reagan's invasions. Uh, backwards to Nixon. I mean, there's a lot of kind of when we close our eyes and we think about U.S. forms of intervention, but
DI manipulation, School of the Americas,
so
training the generals, training like the prison guards, right? I mean, that is that history. And it's not that none of that is happening now, but it's also these other things that you mentioned, right? Like
there's a
now,
much expanded set of interventions that are available to the United States government. As much as we think of their hand as being more limited or more constrained by stronger norms, institutions that are designed to protect, the sovereign right of self-determination, actually, the U.S. has developed a richer set of forms of intervention. So let's go through the different types. The
like
first
one
type,
thing that I just think is worth mapping just in terms of the trajectory is like you also have this transition from like tanks to banks, right? Like the IMF, the World Bank acts as this intermediary role, imposing structural adjustment during the debt crises of the 80s and 90s, right? So part of what we're seeing is that the Trump administration just cuts out the middleman, right?
yeah.
Okay, so take it from there.
Well, let's start with those economic tools, Naomi, because I think that they're no less relevant than ever. So take the case of Argentina, right? We would not have Javier Milei as president of Argentina if it were not for the International Monetary Fund. Donald Trump was president in 2018 when the US, against the bylaws of the IMF itself, and through a call that he directly made to Lagarde, overrode those bylaws to issue the largest loan in IMF history as a way of bolstering the electoral prospects of then President Macri against the more insurgent, progressive, kind of Kirchnerista part of the political spectrum in Argentina. As a result of that, even though Macri lost that election and the progressive government came to power in the form of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, they were drowning in debt. And despite their best efforts to redress that debt burden, the Argentine economy suffered tremendously as a result of that same those same mechanisms, tactics that we have been seeing, I guess, for almost a half century now in forms of IMF intervention and structural adjustment. So those tools really haven't gone anywhere else. As you say, they've gotten more vicious. In the legislative elections that were effectively a midterm referendum on Milei, the U.S. just gave $20 billion to Milei. And that's not just to float the government in macro terms, it's to send a message to voters in Argentina. If you want to be on the right side of this administration to keep benefiting, even if the carrots are very, very small, vote for Javier Milei, vote for La Libertad Avanza, because if you think this is bad now, just wait until we actually settle into, whipping our hand against our perceived opposition in Argentina. So the
And just
economic
slow
tools,
that down, right? They put it on the table during the election and said you will only get this money if you vote the right way,
and they've
right?
done that. They've done that now in multiple successive elections. Honduras was another good case of this. Colombia was another. We will strip out. This is during an electoral process. We will strip out all of our economic support for the country if you don't vote for our preferred candidate. And I'll get to the political interventions later. That's sort of outright endorsement. But just on the question of economic stuff alone. So you have the power of the Treasury. I think it's helpful to understand the IMF. Kind of ball knowers know the IMF is really an extension of the US Treasury. There's not much other room to maneuver, despite the fact that Europeans nominally manage the fund in the form of the Georgieva in the present moment. But they have a range of other tools, sanctions, and forms of economic warfare that the United States has used against its perceived adversaries across the region, and sieges. I mean, in January of this year, we saw the United States ratchet up, not just from a blockade of Cuba, which of course is over 6 decades old, not just with a state sponsor of terror designation, which all but excludes the Cuban economy from any transactions with the global economy, but an outright fuel blockade, which means that any country sending fuel to power the island's schools, hospitals, and homes would be confiscated by the United States government. So there's a range of carrots and sticks that attend to our economic might and supremacy in the hemisphere that are available for U.S. intervention in the region towards this project of realignment. Then there are the military tools. This has been the kind of most shocking, and I think one of the parts, Naomi, that's really least commented on, that's really scary. So yesterday, U.S. Southern Command announced, which is our view of the hemisphere, the invention of a new hemispheric task force. This is basically going to see us move from these extrajudicial strikes again on fishermen. Now, hundreds of fatalities
Yeah.
of nationals from not just Mexico, not just Colombia, not just Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, all over the Caribbean Sea. We've had fishermen assassinated and rather pornographically. These videos published by Secretary of War Pete Hegseth online. That was one kind of doctrine of just basically like, you know, ramping up these attacks in the sea against these fishermen that were, supposedly narco terrorists, but now trying to move inland under the banner of a kind of very, 9/11 meets the war on drugs new doctrine of taking on the narco terrorists. That's really the new project. So they're moving from strikes against. Oh, can you all hear me? Naomi is paused for me. Uh-oh.
Oh, okay. I'm still here. All right. We lost David, but I think we'll get him again. Um, do I have to send him another invite or does he have a standing invite? I think he has. I'll invite him again just in case. All right. He was in the middle of a very important point, and and it's very much related to Honduras. This claim that what they're actually doing is, all right.
Sorry, what happened? My fault.
No, I'm sure not. Um, I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying about the way the sort of war on the quote unquote narco terrorists is the cover, and then you have the ultimate irony of Honduras, right? And what the Trump administration did in pardoning the former president of Honduras. I mean, so remind us about this because the news
Sure.
happens fast and we forget about outrages like that
I
happen.
think that Honduras is the country through which we can best understand the stakes of this, of the present kind of new Monroe Doctrine, because it's really, to take Greg Grandin's phrase, as you said, Naomi, it's really a workshop. It's really a laboratory.
Yeah.
So for the first interesting thing to understand about I'll tell a story as efficiently as I can, but it's so unknown and so scandalous. It's worth telling it, at least, over the course of the period. So there's a coup in Honduras against this democratically elected progressive government. Hillary Clinton says, okay, go for it. It's a banana republic anyway. Doesn't matter. And through the course of 12 years of this narco dictatorship overseen by Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was then, of course, convicted for 45 years for corruption and drug trafficking in an open and shut case, right, with audios and all the evidence in the world. The main thing he does, his principal innovation, was to create these special economic zones, basically selling national territory.
Enter Peter Thiel.
And Peter Thiel's fund, Pronomos Capital, takes advantage of this new law, the SEDES law, passed in 2013, to buy a chunk of the Caribbean coast, the so-called Mosquito Coast, off of Honduras, to build this Bitcoin paradise. And the first thing the progressive government did when it comes back to power is they derogated that law. They eliminated that law by consensus. They said this is a violation. It's unconstitutional. They knew it was unconstitutional back then, which is why Juan Orlando Hernandez had to fire 5 Supreme Court justices, install lackeys to pass this law about the SEDES, and introduce this unconstitutional idea of special economic zones that would belong to Peter Thiel's people. And when they derogated that law, when they eliminated this SEDES law, the first thing that they did with the help of the Trump Republicans was to take the state of Honduras, the government of Xiomara Castro, to the World Bank's secret arbitration court for $11 billion, which is 2/3 of the annual budget of the Honduran state, things that would otherwise be used for health, for housing, and for education, with the open support of Trump and his lackeys. It's no surprise then
for people to know this was not a theoretical desire. They went ahead and tried to build their, sometimes these are called startup countries. It's named Prospera.
Still there.
Astra and I talk about it as basically a glorified med spa / gated community. They have their gated community by the beach, and you can also get experimental gene therapy
Totally unregulated. Everything's unregulated. So all the labor laws, environmental laws are completely deregulated, which means that the local indigenous communities were protesting this, saying they're poisoning our rivers, they're poisoning our sea because it was private property. Now, you might be wondering, how is it possible they bought this little development and then asked for $11 billion? It was because they used more forms of economic warfare to achieve that number, using other instruments that I won't bore your audience with, but so-called most favored nation principles that are built into free trade agreements that the United States designs and deploys across Latin America to project what's called expected future lost profits 50 years into the future to say, oh, because we're being expropriated, we want $11 billion, knowing they're not going to get $11 billion, but they might settle for two. But actually, they weren't satisfied just to get a settlement from the state, which they probably would have won because the World Bank is, again, an extension of the US government. Instead, they basically hired Roger Stone to, push Donald Trump to orchestrate an electoral coup. And actually, downstairs in the seminar that I'm hosting today is Marlon Ochoa, former finance minister, and then was a representative on the National Electoral Council while all this was taking place. He's now living in exile in Mexico because they put a target on his back. That with the help of Israel, the state of Israel, not a coincidence, again, Honduras, part of the Hague group that, as you know, the Progressive International has been working to set up. Not a coincidence that many of the governments we lost were founding members of the Hague group, among them Cuba, Colombia, Bolivia, and Honduras. Israel
So
stood very
just
outside.
to slow you down, David, for people who
Sorry.
aren't paying as close attention, the Hague Group is a group of governments that came together to hold Israel accountable for the genocide in Gaza and try to apply international law in the failure of UN leadership and so on. So uh, Gustavo Petro played a key role. Honduras was also a founding member. So it is U.S. intervention, but there's also a lot of Israeli intervention in
Yeah, and Latin America has been a very vocal continent when it comes to Palestine because of its understanding of what colonialism looks like, what genocide looks like, because of its commitment to international law for obvious reasons that relate to its relationship to the United States. And the state of Israel, which was never really very present in Latin America, has become very present. It's very common at the rallies for these far right figures to see Israeli flags fly. Part of that is the influence of the U.S. evangelical church in places like Brazil and elsewhere. Part of it's because of this open alliance that's been made between the new far right in Latin America and the state of Israel. And one of the challenges we have is we just don't know the full extent of Black Cube or Team Jorge of their interventions in Latin America. Gustavo Petro is saying that the state of Israel intervened in their elections to the tune of several hundreds of thousands of votes. Trying to present some evidence and get it going, but we don't have the kind of hard evidence that we still would want to be able to document these interventions. What we do know in the case of Honduras, for example, is after this electoral coup was conducted and successfully, the first trip that Tito Asfura, the president-elect, took even before he was president, even before he went to Washington, was to Jerusalem to kiss the ring and
Is everyone following this?
show allegiance to Netanyahu.
So thanks to Roger Stone and the whole Miami mafia, they release the former president, intervene in the elections, get his sort of chosen successor in power. Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's a multi-part, like that successful lobbying campaign was connected to the elections.
It's really helpful, I think, to come back to this question of the toolkit. In Honduras, we saw the combination of economic instruments. I spoke about the arbitration courts, investor state dispute settlement, the pressure that was applied to Honduras as a result of trying to reclaim their sovereignty. We saw the military instruments because Honduras is the headquarters of the U.S. Southern Command. Palmarola, if you want to fly to the capital of Honduras, which is Tegucigalpa, you have to fly into a U.S. military base. So there's U.S. military all over there pressuring the government there, combined with sort of political interventions, with the ambassador playing an outsized role, with outright endorsements from the government of the United States, or in this case, the Trump administration, forms of an electoral intervention, right, which is their way of messing with software, with electoral vote counts, with bribes of officials on a National Electoral Council, which is what ended up transpiring. So it's a case that really tells a rich story of what are the sort of the tactics that the U.S. uses and the stakes of the conversation we're having. Because it's helpful to ask, many people in the chat are asking, why are they doing this? What is the purpose of this new Monroe Doctrine? And the stakes are to reestablish colonialism in the hemisphere. There's been, a century of struggle for self-determination, which is reclaiming their resources and their labor and trying to balance hemispheric relations so that they can have more of a right to development. The United States wants to reinstall core periphery relations in the region. And they say this very openly in the National Security Strategy, which was published in December of last year, where they specifically refer to a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that 200-year-old doctrine that establishes supposedly the sacred right of the United States to intervene in the region. And what they're saying is, we want your resources, we want your labor, and we want it at cheap cost. We're going to deny you that right to development, and we see your sovereignty as a barrier, as an obstacle to our ability to secure it.
And also, I mean, I think highlighting the Hague Group and countries that were bringing other, like, Latin American countries together into a bloc, it's also about isolating, right? So that it is so that that dream of a unified Americas is not possible, and that ability to combine power when you're up against a superpower like the United States isn't realized, right? Like that's really key. And then I think when people see that, sometimes they decide, look, we don't have a chance up against the superpower, right? So it's kind of like a learned helplessness that is being imposed, which is also an old and new trick.
This is, I think, the saddest part of watching this process unfold, and try as mightily as I and my friends have to, deliver humanitarian aid to Cuba or organize collective action in Latin America. It's obvious that Latin America, if it's divided, it falls. If it's united, it stands a chance of kind of confronting the United States. And the other people who know that is the United States, or really the Trump administration knows this really well. They're playing a divide and conquer strategy very effectively. It's not a coincidence that the first state to leave ever the coalition of Latin American Caribbean states that's called CELAC, which was the first body that was made as a universal umbrella, excluding the United States, of all the countries in the region, was Jair Bolsonaro.
Mhm.
And it's not a coincidence that the United States has gone about disarticulating, disunifying, and deactivating the traditional mechanisms of Latin American coordination. CELAC is one of them. UNASUR, which was the Union of South American States, that built the first achievement of UNASUR, as you said, Naomi, was to build a South American military coordination mechanism so they could train in an autochthonous way their own generals instead of going to the School of the Americas to be trained by the United States. So they built a defense council out of UNASUR. And now the headquarters of UNASUR sits out on the outskirts of Quito, abandoned. All these mechanisms, SICA, CELAC, UNASUR, I could go on with the mechanisms of regional coordination and integration, are basically fallow, are gone, are disactivated and disarticulated, because the US has been very effective at trying to pursue a certain bilateralism. And the
Yeah.
hard part, and here we come to the self-criticism, is that many of our allies, I should be careful about what I say here, but to speak frankly, many of our friends and allies in the region have fallen into the same trap of bilateralism instead of pursuing collective action. One of the things that Donald Trump does very well is he convinces you that if we get along well, Naomi, you and I'll go light on you. I can hold back these monsters. These guys want your head, but if we have a good relationship, it's fine. And many people, Lula da Silva, Claudia Sheinbaum, and even Gustavo Petro among them, they think that a successful visit to the White House will stop this giant machine from trampling over their political economic project. They think that one good call over the phone will save them too. And I think the lesson is really being hard learned by a lot of our allies in the region. The only thing that can stop these maniobras, these sort of maneuvers of the United States, these machinations, is a common front, a united front, and it's collective action in the form of institutions that have the ability to build common infrastructure, support an energy transition, support financial integration, so they're less dependent on the United States and therefore less vulnerable to the whipsaw of Trump's, whims.
One of the things that's really exciting, and I think it was really wonderful to see when I participated in last year's Pan American Congress, was that the U.S. was there. That the progressive members of Congress, several of them, several members of the so-called Squad, uh, participated, in really significant ways, and it reduced their sense of isolation. It was really interesting talking to members of Congress and just I think it was kind of relaxing for them to just be in a place where they weren't being treated like it was such an extreme position to call a genocide, and where a lot of things were taken for granted. And so it's also about building that kind of power, right? And there's a delegation that's coming from Canada as well.
Totally.
They don't get any special treatment. It's just they're part of the Americas, like Bad Bunny said.
Yeah, and this year we're bringing four primary winners. So in addition to the members of, so we
Amazing.
have both sides. We know people like Claire Valdez and Daria Lisa and Chris Rabb who are coming down to Uruguay. But we also really importantly, Naomi, and this is where we come, I think, to getting a bit out of the hoyo, out of the sort of well of desperation and desolation, and to some more hope. Is the delegation this year is led by Representatives Jayapal and Jackson, who are
Oh,
both on the House Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States Congress, and looking ahead to the possibility that the Democratic Party might take back the House in November. They're seeing this trip as a kind of fact finder. They want to look at the full range, the full scope, panoramic scope, as we've been discussing, of U.S. interventions to set up an agenda for accountability to say, when we take back this committee, we are not going to let the last 2 years of rampant criminal and colonial intervention go unaccounted for. We want to bring these people before Congress, seek some kind of justice or at least answers for the things that we know we don't know, and hopefully uncovering some of the things we don't know. Because
yeah.
we've talked through some of the most pyrotechnic aspects of
Yeah.
U.S. intervention, but much of this stuff is subterranean. The deals that are being made, the
Yeah.
extraction of resources, we don't know that much.
I think that's very heartening to hear. Representative Jayapal was not there last year, so that this is great. It's becoming a more important gathering for U.S. progressives to go to. And it's going to be a larger caucus this year
Yeah.
because of these wins, and we're not through the cycle yet. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think, but one of the things that one of the questions that we got was like, what can we do from here? And that's one of the things from here to keep your eye on. What is the accountability going to be? Because when I look at like this story of the rise of the right, the rise and fall of the right in Latin America, and the entanglements with U.S. empire, it is a story of impunity. Many of the countries that we've talked about had truth and reconciliation processes, genocide trials for their local genocidaires, the people, the generals, the torturers, some of them did come to justice, not all of them by any means. But there was a process, in Guatemala, in Argentina, in Brazil. The US never had that process. The US never had a real, there was a church committee, but there was not a legal process of holding the people at the CIA, the School of the Americas, accountable for their entanglement with these crimes. And impunity compounds, right? And so part of what we're seeing now is because of the failure to hold, a failure in the United States to hold themselves accountable, right?
Totally. I
When
mean, when 3 years ago, I coordinated that delegation that, or 4 years ago now, that Representative Ocasio-Cortez led, that we went to Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. And it was on that trip that we made this final push in coordination with the government of Gabriel Boric to declassify the documents related to U.S. involvement in the 73 coup, which the U.S. up to that point had still not really admitted it was ever related to, or even though anyone knew, you know? And I think that this brings up a really important point, I think, for a US audience in particular, which I was just pointing out here in
By the way,
the.
we have almost 1,000 people watching, David. Isn't that great?
I'll watch my words very carefully, which is that I think it's surprising when part of my job as a US American, in trying to build bridges between different parts of the hemisphere, North and South, is not just to build community, epistemic, political, collaborative community. That's part of it. So people can feel that they're part of something bigger than just in their own countries, but also that for people in the United States to hear how Latin America thinks about U.S. intervention. I'll give you one example. Latin America takes the CIA very seriously, and they should. The CIA basically planned and executed the bombing of Caracas and the kidnapping of Maduro. Yesterday, the New York Times published the CIA's set up a special task force for Cuba, which we know is a preamble to an invasion there. In Mexico, the CIA was responsible for, a huge Fast and Furious campaign that brought a lot of U.S. weapons into the country, basically structured a lot of the cartel system as we know it. And that's to say nothing of the rest of South America, right? For some reason in the United States, we don't ever talk about the CIA. Maybe some fringe sectors of an ultra left that we barely consider to be part of our political discussion talk about the CIA. But at a serious institutional level, we don't really take it that seriously. And so, maybe it sounds to a US American ear a little bit sort of like conspiracy theorist, but we have to engage with those concerns really seriously about what is the US up to in our countries. Why is the State Department always conspiring at the backs of progressive forces in these countries to undermine them repeatedly? What role did the U.S. Justice Department play in the incarceration of Lula? Lula likes to say,
Right.
first think of the gringos, then think of the gringos, and third, think of the gringos. And after you've thought about the gringos 3 times, think of them one more time. And if you go back and hear what he was saying when he was being put in prison, he had no doubts that Lava Jato was in many ways mounted as a U.S. response to kind of insurgent Brazilian power on the hemispheric and global stage in the construction
Was
of
the
bricks.
sort of trumped up corruption charges that put him in jail. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, the charges that eventually saw him spend years in prison before he was able to clear his name and come back and run for the presidency in 2022. And so I think that there is, for you, reading your piece was so refreshing to see, Vero and others, take stock really of this U.S. interventions. One of the ways in which I hit my head against the wall is when I go to Washington and I sit down with a lot of our caucus members and I say, this is crazy. I mean, what are we doing? And sometimes it's hard to get our electeds to care about Latin America or even to believe the things that are being said really out loud and outspokenly by the administration. Yesterday, Trump gave a press conference where he said about Venezuela, to the victor go the spoils. Right?
I mean, this is the thing, David, is that, people will talk a good game about holding Trump accountable for the massive corruption that we barely understand about the self-enrichment of this administration. It's not just Trump, it's his entire cabinet, I think. We will never understand that unless we have an internationalist lens, because they aren't just making money off of the United States. It is a global project, right? And like, I think ground zero of this is Miami, really, and it is a very mafioso project where they're granting each other impunity. They're getting each other out of jail, right? Whether it's in the U.S. or whether, it's in Brazil. I mean, this is
Totally.
this deal, right? But what's that? What do they get in exchange? This is what we have to understand. And I don't think we do. I don't think we've really wrapped around our heads around what the project is, the role. We haven't even talked about Peter Thiel and what he's doing in Argentina.
And no one
Um,
knows, but Naomi,
yeah,
this is a known unknown. So I've been working really hard on the Palantir question in Argentina and talking with friends of ours at CELS and other really important investigative outlets. They will say to you, we do not know. We know that Peter Thiel's in the Casa Rosada. We know that he's meeting with the government. We know that he's building his mansion with the bones of the Argentine state. But we don't know what's being agreed. These are like really open questions that are important to set that agenda for accountability. But you more than anyone else, Naomi, I mean, as an intellectual, as a scholar, as an advocate, have shed a lot of light on the military industrial aspects of what's going on. That when we talk about the militarization, for example, the buildup in the Caribbean, the new partnership in Ecuador, when we talk about narco terror, we're also talking about money. We're talking about money in terms of
right.
contracts, in terms of procurement. We're talking about the private prisons that we know U.S. companies are involved with at CCOT and elsewhere. There is a huge industry here, and it's one that we're obviously seeing play out. There's a case of that one migrant who was being flown on a jet 4 times in the United States. I think those deportation flights cost $20 million for one.
And
One's
the whole thing is privatized, right?
holding
Like,
80,
prisons are
85%.
private, planes are private. And yeah, this is so beyond what I wrote about in the shock doctrine in terms of this whole complex, this sprawling complex. They also see the climate crisis as an opportunity in and of itself of sort of privatizing rescue and so on. But it isn't an ideological project in any way, shape, or form like it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, this is not neoliberalism, right? This is much more a global kleptocracy mask off, I think.
Yeah, I think that the word colonial is a fair description in the sense that the early forms of colonial that had that sort of vague pre-structured relationship, for example, between the Dutch East India Company and the British Crown, that was really sack the country of resources, and then having the political power come in and try to structure that that transnational trade of that plundering of the periphery, and that's what we're seeing a lot. The frontier is you know these plundering corporations, whether they're taking resources out of the Amazon or from lithium mines in Chile, or labor exploitation, or just land grabbing in places like Puerto Rico as a result of disaster capitalism, as your book showed so well. And you know, the frontier still remains capital, but the U.S. is now coming in to back that form of rapacious pillaging, plundering capital, um, in the form of this Don Roe doctrine. And so it's not neoliberalism in the sense that it's not being structured with an ideological idea of what the perfect political economy will look like, because they're not speaking about growth. They're not speaking about development. They're not speaking about sort of shit and sustainability. They're just speaking about securing dominance, resources, access, wealth, in explicitly unequal terms that have defined colonialism for multiple centuries.
And I think there is still the dream of starting their own countries, that the dream that Prospera represents in Honduras. That they were willing to kind of stage a coup over it. You know, Patagonia has always been a big dream, for this idea of escape, and that is not that doesn't mean it isn't colonialism. This is how colonialism started. I mean, always say Canada was a company before it was a country, um, and and so in some ways it's coming full circle. But I think that where things are different is there really isn't a role for people in any of this. This is a very, very elite project. It's sort of based on this idea that only very few people are going to have any kind of comfort in the coming cataclysm. So the stakes are incredibly high. You have this big summit coming up, and I think that for the remainder of our time together, it would be good to think about, just maybe tell people how they can get involved in this attempt to push back in various ways. Um, and I think it is worth remembering that the pushback is happening in the United States as well, right? I mean, this wave of primaries is really significant. Um, I've got a call after this with a mass organizing call with our friends at Jewish Voice for Peace
Yeah.
Action. And it's part gloating and part planning, just in terms of how many JVP endorsed candidates, DSA candidates, have been winning these primaries. But we also, like, what we're also dealing with is a two-front war, right? Because you've got Marco Rubio declaring open war on the left, and now we have the center declaring its own war on the left, right? We have Third Way today reporting that they're going to spend $15 million between now and the presidential election trying to defeat not Donald Trump, but democratic socialism.
Yeah.
Um, so what do you see as the stakes?
Well, it's been an interesting few months. Never, I mean, I should have been a bit more clear-minded about this, but in March, I led this humanitarian convoy to Cuba where we delivered 50 tons of aid, respirators, pacemakers, cancer medicine, cold chain deliveries of medicine, and they've basically headhunted us ever since through Treasury investigations of sanctions violations and Department of Justice violations. Basically trying to paint us again as terrorists or giving material support to Cuba, a state sponsor of terror. So an interesting twice in 6 months, really, to first for Gaza and then the slow motion genocide that we're seeing in Cuba. See how again effective they've been at kind of reviving the ghosts of McCarthy in this case. But to take your point really seriously, Naomi, about the declaration of war by Third Way against DSA and against the insurgent kind of, I would say, just principled leadership of the new progressive movement. more than any left-wing sort of specter that's haunting the United States. What they really fear is principle. Really, that tells me one thing, which is that the best way to defeat this doctrine is to get involved in these local campaigns. I have a PhD in political economy. The major thing I've studied is the transformation of party systems over the 20th and 21st century. And there was a very teleological idea that dominated that literature for a long time, that capital-intensive strategies were always going to beat labor-intensive ones. If you had enough money, you could buy enough ad spend, you could put your face on a billboard, you were just going to beat anyone who was trying to do old machine style mobilizing. And now, finally, we've broken that model, as Abdul's Senate race in Michigan showed. What we're seeing is that getting involved, getting organized, mobilizing, these things that for a long time I think felt like flaccid instruments that were unable to really push back against the system in a powerful way, we're beginning to win on the basis of those mobilizations, of connecting with people on the doorstep, of talking about why it's so important to get out and vote for candidates who care, not ones who simply want to keep the seat warm while collecting a paycheck and insider trading on behalf of their portfolio of weapons manufacturer stocks. So I think that what's most exciting when I look across the Pan American situation is seeing this movement really rise to the occasion. And I think it felt a lot worse, a lot more desperate a year ago, where I thought, wow, we really are so in this asymmetry of where the administration is at. We started this call by me saying I was taking my hat off to Marco Rubio, but principally because they got us out the gate. Many people underestimated and didn't take seriously Project 2025. These kinds of announcements of what this foreshadowing of what this administration would look like. And it took us some time, as it would take a body and antibodies to respond to that virus. What we're seeing now is how important each and every one of the 1,000 people on this call can be in transforming their community structure, their electoral structure, and ultimately having major consequences for the future of the pursuit of accountability and justice on behalf of peoples abroad. But I think it's also really helpful to think about today we were talking about this in the seminar downstairs and here in the Senate about what are the most important things for the peoples of the region. And I will say just a couple of them are really, really important for the US. If I could highlight two policies that I would think are the most solidaristic, not charitable, not good for them, maybe not for us, but linking struggles. The first is gun control. I know it sounds like an old liberal fight that was fought and failed. The most important thing here in Mexico, but also in Haiti, also in Brazil, also in Colombia, is that we stop the flow of guns through our southern border, because all the violence that's being committed by paramilitaries in the fields of Colombia or in the streets of Ciudad Juarez are being committed with U.S. guns. So they're begging. In fact, there's an open case by the Mexican state against U.S. gun manufacturers. They won't win it, but they're making a point that this is an issue of sovereignty and community safety. Gun control needs to become, again, a progressive cause célèbre that we take seriously for our own communities and those in neighboring countries. And the second is mental health and drug addiction. Everyone says that this war on drugs, which is now being framed as a narco-terror doctrine for striking fishermen, invading countries like Honduras and Guatemala through this new U.S. Southcom strategy of operations, is being done to fight the cartels. And what they're asking is, why aren't you attending to the root causes of consumption of fentanyl in the United States and elsewhere? Why aren't you attending to what they understand to be these zombie cities in places like Philadelphia or my hometown, Los Angeles, when we know that consumption is what's fueling the drug trade to begin with? And so these are policies that I think for us, as progressives, as left-wing, agitators and organizers, they need to be at the front of our agenda, because there's stuff that's so important to our own community well-being, but stuff that's so meaningful to our neighbor nations abroad.
Wow, that's like we never hear of that perspective. Or at least I feel like, but it's so important. Abolishing ICE is also important.
First, yes. Oh, sorry, but there's three. Also, abolishing ICE and the massive apparatus of profiteering from the suffering of economic migrants and refugees.
And understanding the role of that attacks on indigenous rights like the role that how central that is to this project, right? Because indigenous land rights in particular are also one of the ways in which this project of a lot of it is just land grabbing is being resisted, right? So now there's a very frontal coordinated attack, coordinated by groups like the Atlas Network from Chile to Canada to attack indigenous land rights, um, and using all kinds of disinformation. Um, but what I loved about my experience at the Pan American Congress, really as a Canadian, with friends from the U.S. there, I'm dual Canadian U.S. citizen, but just like we were just one seat at the table, no special treatment. Welcome to the Americas. And learn a little bit about solidarity, and but also just getting that clear message that we have to get our own house in order. The message to Canadians was deal with your mining companies. Your mining companies are destroying our territories and acting as if they are sovereigns unto themselves. That's our job. And obviously, the people from the United States have lots of work. But this has been really, really helpful, David. And if people want to tune in, follow what's happening at the Congress, follow your work, what are some of the good
Yeah.
channels?
I mean, go to our, we have a beautiful new website, which features Naomi's shining face from the Congress on its homepage. So panamericancongress.org, a new Instagram channel, Congreso Points Panamericano, like Pan American Congress, but in Spanish, as dominated as it is by the Spanish language for the time being. And then from Uruguay, we'll have this very beautiful public event at the downtown Teatro Solis that will be live streaming. And so we'll be sure to basically put out the flyer for that, the link for that, the transmission of that when we'll have participants from all 15 countries that are coming together in Uruguay this year, which includes, Barbados and Puerto Rico, just like it includes Guatemala and Honduras, just like it includes Jamaica and Brazil. So important. Hearing these perspectives combine and collide and forge that solidarity agenda, I think is going to be a really enriching thing for people to tune into, and hopefully for them to take back to their respective constituencies as we try to advance with a politics that is not ignorant of the struggles of others, but is understanding that they're part and parcel of our own. So this is, again, not a call for charity or thinking that they're over there and we're over here, and it's so hard to hear about their plight. It's really to understand that the fight against the oligarchy, if you want to put it in those terms, is fundamentally transnational and can only be won by each and every one of us getting involved in the ways that we can.
Uh, well, to quote somebody in the chat here, great guest, bro cooked. I agree. You did really. This was such a joy, David. Even though the subjects are heavy, I always feel full of a sense of resolve when I speak with you. We will also try to figure out a way to live stream that opening of the Congress, because there's
Great.
fantastic speakers, and we need that sort of shot of joy and determination. And thank you all for joining. More than 1,000 of you. Share the link when it's out there with your friends who missed it, and keep spreading the word.
Thanks, Naomi. Thank you all for joining. See you soon.
Bye, all.